Over the following months, Seth continued his observations of Earth while trying to understand what he had witnessed during the California earthquake. He told himself that Jake Martinez was just one unusual human, and that most of the species would behave according to logical self-preservation patterns. But the more he watched, the more confused he became. In a city called Detroit, Seth observed a human teacher named Lisa Wong, who stayed at her school long after the normal working hours ended. Every day she remained behind to help students who were struggling with their lessons. Seth monitored her personal finances and discovered that she was using her own money to buy supplies for children whose families could not afford them. This behavior puzzled Seth greatly. Lisa Wong was not related to these students. Helping them provided no benefit to her survival or social status. In fact, it cost her time, money, and energy that she could have used for her own advancement. Yet she continued this pattern day after day without anyone forcing her to do it. Seth documented this as another anomaly and continued his surveillance. In a desert region, humans called Afghanistan, Seth watched military units engaged in combat operations. He expected to see the violence and chaos that previous reports had described. Instead, he witnessed something that shocked him even more than the earthquake rescue. A human soldier named Carlos Rivera was moving with his squad when enemy forces attacked them with explosive devices. One of these weapons landed directly among the group of soldiers. Carlos Rivera could have run away to save himself, but instead he threw his body on top of the explosive device. The explosion killed Carlos Rivera instantly, but his action saved the lives of 6 other soldiers. Seth played the recording multiple times trying to understand the logic behind this decision. Carlos Rivera had chosen certain death to protect humans he had known for only a few months. This went against every survival instinct that evolution should have programmed into any intelligent species. Seth added this incident to his growing file of unexplained human behaviors. In a research facility in Boston, Seth observed a scientist named Dr. Benjamin Clark, who was working on treatments for a rare disease that affected human children. Dr. Clark worked 18 hours every day, including weekends and holidays. Multiple pharmaceutical companies offered him large amounts of money to sell his research, but he refused all of them. When Seth investigated further, he discovered that Dr. Clark had a child who died from this same disease years earlier. The scientist was not trying to save his own offspring, since that was no longer possible. He was working to prevent other parents from experiencing the same loss he had suffered. This pattern of behavior appeared throughout human society. Seth found a grandmother named Helen Foster, who spent her retirement years preparing food for homeless military veterans. She had no connection to these people and received no payment for her work. Yet she arrived at the feeding center every morning at dawn to begin cooking meals. In a school, Seth observed a teenage human named Marcus Johnson, who regularly defended a disabled classmate from bullying by larger students. Marcus was smaller than the bullies and often got hurt during these confrontations. The logical choice would have been to avoid conflict and protect himself, but Marcus continued to intervene whenever he saw his classmate being threatened. Seth watched a surgeon named Dr. Amy Rodriguez, who used her vacation time to travel to war zones where she performed medical operations without payment. She could have relaxed at safe locations or earned money during this time. Instead, she chose to risk her life helping injured humans in dangerous areas. These examples multiplied as Seth expanded his surveillance network. He began monitoring social media communications, news reports, and government databases to get a broader picture of human behavior patterns. What he found disturbed him greatly. The individual acts of selflessness and courage were not rare exceptions as he had hoped. They were happening everywhere every single day. Humans regularly donated blood to help strangers. They volunteered their time at hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations. They sent money to disaster victims in distant countries they had never visited. Seth discovered that humans had created entire systems dedicated to helping each other. Organizations called charities collected resources to feed hungry people, provide medical care to the sick, and offer shelter to the homeless. These institutions operated in every human society, regardless of government type, religious beliefs, or economic status. Most puzzling was that humans often helped members of different ethnic groups, nationalities, and belief systems. Zeth found records of Christians helping Muslims, Americans aiding people in Africa, and wealthy individuals giving money to complete strangers. This cross-group cooperation violated every principle of tribal loyalty that governed most galactic civilizations. Zeth began submitting reports to the Confederation, but found himself struggling to categorize these behaviors. The official classification system had categories for violence, territorial disputes, resource competition, and mating rituals. But there was no category for voluntary self-sacrifice to benefit unrelated individuals. When Zeth requested clarification from his superiors, they told him to focus on documenting the wars, crimes, and environmental destruction that previous observers had reported. Commander Vex 2314 sent him a message saying that individual anomalies did not represent the true nature of the species. But Zeth could no longer ignore what he was seeing. The acts of violence and destruction were real, but they were not the complete picture. For every human who committed a crime, there seemed to be dozens who spent their time helping others. For every act of hatred, there were hundreds of examples of compassion. Zeth began to suspect that previous observers had only looked for behaviors that confirmed their existing beliefs about human nature. They had documented the violence because that was what they expected to find. But they had dismissed or ignored the overwhelming evidence of cooperation and altruism. The more Zeth studied human history, the more convinced he became that the Confederation had fundamentally misunderstood this species. Humans were not primarily violent or chaotic. They were a species that had evolved an extraordinary capacity for empathy and self-sacrifice. This realization troubled Zeth because it contradicted everything the Confederation believed about the development of intelligent life. According to Galactic science, altruistic behavior only emerged in highly advanced civilizations after millions of years of careful social engineering. Most species required genetic modifications to develop the ability to care about unrelated individuals. Yet here were these supposedly primitive humans demonstrating levels of moral reasoning that most Confederation species could not achieve, even with technological assistance. They seemed to have evolved this capacity naturally without any external intervention. Zeth began researching human evolution and discovered something even more disturbing. Unlike every other known intelligent species, humans had not evolved from prey animals. They had been persistence hunters who worked in groups to chase down much larger and stronger creatures. This meant that human psychology was fundamentally different from that of other galactic civilizations. Where most species had learned cooperation as a survival strategy against predators, humans had developed it as a hunting technique. Their entire social structure was built around the idea that groups could accomplish things that individuals could not. Zeth realized that this difference might explain the behaviors he had been observing. Humans did not see helping others as a burden or sacrifice. They saw it as a natural extension of their group-oriented thinking. When one human was in danger, others automatically responded as if they were all part of the same hunting pack. This insight made Zeth reconsider everything he had learned about human warfare and conflict. Maybe the violence was not evidence of their primitive nature. Maybe it was evidence of how fiercely they protected members of their group when they perceived threats. As Zeth prepared his next report to the Confederation, he struggled with how to present these findings. His superiors wanted confirmation that humans were a chaotic and dangerous species that posed a threat to galactic stability. But Zeth was beginning to suspect that the real threat was not human violence or unpredictability. The real threat was that humans represented a completely different model of how intelligent life could develop. If the Confederation acknowledged this, it would challenge fundamental assumptions about evolution, psychology, and social organization that had guided galactic civilization for millions of years. Zeth decided to continue his observations before drawing any final conclusions. But he could no longer dismiss the pattern he was seeing as mere anomalies. There was something profound about human nature that previous observers had missed completely. The day that changed everything for Zeth began like any other day of observation. He was monitoring routine human activities across North America when his sensors detected unusual aircraft movements over a city called New York. Multiple passenger Planes had deviated from their normal flight paths and were heading toward the urban center. Zeth watched in growing horror as the first aircraft crashed directly into one of the tallest buildings in the city. Flames and smoke poured from the massive structure while debris fell to the streets below. His initial assumption was that this had been an accident caused by mechanical failure or pilot error. Then the second plane struck the adjacent tower. Zeth realized immediately that this was a coordinated attack. Someone had deliberately crashed these aircraft into buildings filled with thousands of innocent humans. This was exactly the kind of senseless violence that previous Confederation reports had described as typical human behavior. As Zeth prepared to document this incident as evidence of human brutality, he expected to see panic and chaos consume the city. Previous galactic studies had shown that most intelligent species became completely disorganized when faced with large-scale attacks. Citizens would flee in random directions while abandoning anyone who was injured or trapped. But what Zeth observed defied every prediction his training had prepared him for. Instead of running away from the burning towers, hundreds of humans were running toward them. These were not military personnel or trained emergency workers. They were ordinary citizens who had witnessed the attacks and decided to help however they could. Zeth watched firefighters like Captain Robert Hayes leading their teams up the stairs of the burning buildings while everyone else was trying to get down. These humans knew that the structures might collapse at any moment, but they continued climbing higher to reach people who were trapped on the upper floors. The Confederation had taught Zeth that rational beings always prioritize their own survival above all other considerations. Yet here were humans deliberately moving into increasing danger to save individuals they had never met before. As the morning progressed, Zeth documented behavior that challenged everything he understood about intelligent life. Police officers, like Tony Rodriguez, worked for hours pulling people from the wreckage despite suffering from smoke inhalation and exhaustion. Construction workers volunteered their equipment and expertise to help with rescue operations without being asked and without expecting payment. When the towers finally collapsed, Zeth assumed that the rescue efforts would end. The rational response would be to retreat to safety and mourn the dead. Instead, thousands of additional humans arrived to join the search for survivors. They worked around the clock, digging through tons of debris with their bare hands, hoping to find anyone who might still be alive. But what truly shattered Zeth's understanding was observing the response of humans who lived far from New York City. Within hours of the attacks, people from across the continent were driving toward the disaster site to offer assistance. They brought food, water, medical supplies, and blankets for the rescue workers and survivors. Zeth monitored communications networks and discovered that humans who lived thousands of miles away were organizing donation drives to collect money for the victims' families. People who had never visited New York and had no personal connection to anyone affected by the attacks were sending whatever resources they could spare. In the days following what humans called September 11th, Zeth observed acts of heroism that would have been considered mythical in Confederation space. He watched ordinary citizens like boat operators ferry hundreds of thousands of people to safety from Manhattan Island. He saw strangers helping strangers without any expectation of reward or recognition. A nurse named Patricia Bell worked for 3 straight days treating injured people until she collapsed from exhaustion. When she woke up in a hospital bed, her first question was whether there were more patients who needed care. A group of construction workers led by Danny Murphy used their vacation time to volunteer at the disaster site, clearing debris and searching for survivors. Zeth found himself particularly fascinated by the behavior of humans who had no special training or equipment, but still tried to help. He watched accountants and teachers and store clerks form human chains to pass supplies to rescue workers. He observed teenagers donating blood even though many of them were frightened by needles. Most puzzling was the reaction of humans toward the attackers themselves. While there was certainly anger and calls for justice, Zeth also documented widespread efforts to protect innocent people who shared the same ethnic or religious background as the terrorists. Human leaders made public statements urging their citizens not to blame entire groups for the actions of a few individuals. This response violated every principle of tribal warfare that governed most galactic civilizations. When one group attacked another, the normal pattern was collective retaliation against all members of the attacking tribe. but humans seemed capable of distinguishing between guilty individuals and innocent bystanders, even when they were emotionally traumatized and seeking revenge. Over the following week, Zeth watched humans engage in behaviors that Confederation scientists had believed were impossible without advanced genetic engineering. They formed support groups to help traumatized survivors cope with their experiences. They created memorials to honor the dead, including the attackers' victims and the rescue workers who died trying to save them. Zeth documented charity organizations that raised billions of dollars to help families who had lost loved ones in the attacks. These donations came from humans at every economic level, including people who could barely afford their own basic needs. Children emptied their piggy banks, and elderly people on fixed incomes sent whatever money they could spare. But perhaps most remarkable was watching humans choose to continue living normal lives despite knowing that similar attacks might happen again. They returned to their jobs in tall buildings and boarded aircraft for travel. Even though these activities now carried additional risks, they refused to allow fear to paralyze their society or change their fundamental values. The Confederation had always taught that such resilience only developed in species that had undergone millions of years of careful social evolution. Most civilizations required extensive psychological conditioning to prevent panic and social collapse during crisis situations. Yet humans seemed to possess this capacity naturally. As Zeth compiled his observations into reports, he struggled to find appropriate categories for what he had witnessed. The Confederation classification system had no framework for describing a species that routinely sacrificed individual welfare for collective benefit. There were no precedents for documenting behavior that prioritized moral principles over survival instincts. Zeth began to realize that the problem was not with human nature, but with the Confederation's understanding of how intelligence could evolve. Every assumption about rational behavior was based on studying species that had developed under completely different evolutionary pressures. The Confederation had concluded that logical thinking meant prioritizing self-preservation and genetic relatives above all other considerations. But humans demonstrated that logic could lead to entirely different conclusions. They had reasoned that their individual survival was less important than the survival of their ideals and their way of life. This insight terrified Zeth because it suggested that everything the Confederation believed about intelligence and civilization might be fundamentally wrong. If humans could develop advanced moral reasoning without genetic modification, then other assumptions about evolutionary development might also be incorrect. Zeth realized that he was no longer just observing an alien species. He was witnessing evidence that intelligence could take forms that the Confederation had never imagined possible. Humans were not chaotic or irrational. They were operating according to a completely different set of logical principles that prioritize group welfare over individual benefit. As Zeth prepared his next report to the Confederation, he knew that his findings would be dismissed as observer error or contaminated data. His superiors would not want to hear that their fundamental assumptions about intelligent life were wrong. But Zeth could no longer deny what he had seen. The events of September 11th had not revealed human weakness or primitive thinking. They had demonstrated that humans possessed psychological capabilities that most Confederation species could not match, even with technological assistance. For the first time since beginning his mission, Zeth began to suspect that the Confederation was not observing humans to assess their threat level. They were watching because they were afraid of what humans might become if they ever developed space travel technology. After witnessing the events of September 11th, Zeth could no longer focus solely on contemporary human behavior. He needed to understand how this species had developed such extraordinary psychological capabilities. He began accessing the Confederation's historical databases to study human evolution and cultural development over thousands of years. What he discovered changed his understanding of everything. Zeth started by examining human technological progress and immediately noticed patterns that defied conventional wisdom about how civilizations advance. According to Confederation science, intelligent species developed new capabilities gradually over millions of years through careful planning and risk management. Each breakthrough required extensive preparation and multiple generations of incremental improvements. But humans seemed to achieve major advances through individuals who ignored expert consensus and pursued goals that everyone else considered impossible. Zeth studied the case of two human brothers named Orville and Wilbur Wright, who had developed the first successful flying machine. For centuries, human scientists had mathematically proven that heavier-than-air flight was impossible. The greatest minds of their time had published detailed calculations showing why objects denser than air could never sustain flight. Yet these two bicycle mechanics had simply ignored the expert opinions and built a working aircraft anyway. They had not possessed advanced degrees or institutional funding. They had succeeded through persistence and experimentation, while the entire scientific establishment was telling them their goal was impossible. This pattern repeated throughout human history. Zeth found countless examples of individuals who had achieved breakthroughs by refusing to accept limitations that seemed absolute to everyone else. A woman named Marie Curie had discovered radioactivity and won Nobel Prizes despite working in a field that most people believed was unsuitable for females. She had continued her research even though the radiation was slowly killing her, because she considered the advancement of human knowledge more important than her personal safety. A group of farmers and merchants had defeated the most powerful military empire on Earth to create something called the United States of America. Professional military experts had calculated that their rebellion had no chance of success. But these humans had fought for years against impossible odds because they believed their cause was worth the sacrifice. Zeth discovered that every major human achievement had emerged from this same psychological pattern. Someone would identify a problem that experts considered unsolvable, then dedicate their entire life to solving it anyway. They did not seem capable of accepting that anything was truly impossible. A scientist named Jonas Salk had developed a vaccine for a disease called polio, then given the formula away for free instead of becoming wealthy from patents. A businessman named Henry Ford had revolutionized manufacturing by treating workers better than industry standards required. A seamstress named Rosa Parks had sparked a civil rights movement by simply refusing to give up her seat on a bus. The more Zeth studied human history, the more he realized that their greatest strength was not intelligence or technology, but their absolute refusal to accept defeat. Other species in the galaxy had evolved complex logical reasoning abilities, but humans had evolved something far more dangerous: the inability to believe that problems could not be solved. This psychological trait explained everything Zeth had observed about human behavior. When Jake Martinez ran into a burning building to save strangers, he was not acting irrationally. He was applying the same mental framework that drove all human achievement: the assumption that there must be a way to accomplish what needed to be done. Zeth began to understand why the Confederation was really monitoring humanity. Every other intelligent species in the galaxy had evolved as prey animals. They had developed intelligence as a survival tool to avoid predators and manage resources more efficiently. Their entire psychology was built around identifying threats and minimizing risks. But humans had evolved as persistence hunters. They had developed intelligence as a tool for solving problems and overcoming obstacles. Where other species saw barriers, humans saw challenges. Where other species calculated odds, humans assumed there must be a solution they had not discovered yet. This fundamental difference in evolutionary background had created two completely different approaches to intelligence. The Confederation used logic to determine what was possible, then operated within those limits. Humans used logic to figure out how to make impossible things possible. Zeth realized that this was why human behavior seemed irrational to Confederation observers. Previous surveillance teams had been looking for evidence of standard logical thinking patterns, but humans were operating according to a completely different logical framework that prioritized problem-solving over risk avoidance. As Zeth deepened his research, he made a discovery that chilled him to his core. He began studying human children to understand how these psychological patterns developed and found that the traits appeared to be innate rather than learned. He observed a young girl named Sophie Adams, who had entered a science competition by designing a water purification system for developing countries. Sophie was only 12 years old, but she had identified a global problem and created an innovative solution using materials that cost less than $10. When asked why she had chosen this project, she simply said that people needed clean water and she wanted to help them. Zeth watched a teenager named Alex Turner, who had built a prosthetic hand using a three-dimensional printer in his family's garage. Alex had been motivated by meeting a child who had lost her hand in an accident. Instead of accepting that high-quality prosthetics were expensive and difficult to obtain, Alex had spent months designing and testing a device that worked better than commercial alternatives while costing a fraction of the price. These examples multiplied as Zeth expanded his surveillance of human educational institutions. He found children and teenagers who looked at problems that had stumped experts for decades and simply asked why no one had fixed them yet. Then, they proceeded to develop solutions using resources available to them through internet research and basic equipment. The pattern was consistent across all human cultures and economic levels. Young humans seemed incapable of accepting that problems were too difficult to solve. They approached challenges with the automatic assumption that solutions existed and just needed to be discovered. Zeth realized that humanity represented an entirely new category of intelligent life. They were not just problem solvers but problem seekers. They actively looked for challenges to overcome, rather than trying to maintain stable equilibrium, like every other known species. This insight explained why human civilization had advanced so rapidly compared to galactic norms. Where other species spent thousands of years carefully evaluating each potential change, humans simply tried new approaches and adapted quickly when they failed. They treated failure as information rather than defeat. But Zeth's most terrifying realization came when he began projecting human development into the future. If this species continued advancing at their current rate, they would achieve interstellar travel within decades rather than the centuries that Confederation models had predicted. More disturbing was imagining what would happen when humans encountered other galactic civilizations. Every species in the Confederation had been shaped by millions of years of careful social engineering designed to minimize conflict and maintain stability. They had learned to coexist peacefully by avoiding competition and accepting established hierarchies. But humans seemed driven to question everything and improve whatever they encountered. They would not simply accept existing galactic structures and limitations. They would immediately begin trying to optimize systems, solve problems, and push boundaries that other species considered fixed. Zeth began to understand why the Confederation was afraid of humanity. It was not because humans were violent or chaotic. It was because they represented a completely different approach to existence that could destabilize the careful balance that had maintained galactic peace for millions of years. Humans did not just adapt to their environment like normal species. They redesigned their environment to meet their needs. They did not accept limitations imposed by natural laws. They found ways to work around those limitations or discovered that the laws were incomplete. Most terrifying of all, humans seemed to view the universe itself as a problem to be solved rather than a system to be endured. They looked at the vast distances between stars and saw engineering challenges rather than insurmountable barriers. They studied death and disease as opponents to be defeated rather than natural processes to be accepted. As Zeth prepared his next report, he realized that his mission had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just observing a potentially dangerous species. He was documenting evidence that everything the Confederation believed about intelligence, evolution, and civilization was wrong. The question was whether his superiors would be willing to acknowledge that truth or whether they would try to eliminate the evidence by destroying humanity before they could reach the stars. Zeth spent weeks preparing his final report to the Confederation High Council. He knew that his findings would challenge fundamental assumptions that had guided galactic civilization for millions of years. But he could no longer deny what he had observed during months of surveillance. The report began with a statement that Zeth knew would shock his superiors. Humanity represented a completely new category of intelligent life that defied every existing model of how consciousness could evolve. Zeth documented his evidence systematically, starting with the basic psychological differences he had identified. While every other known species had developed intelligence as a tool for avoiding problems, humans had evolved it as a method for solving them. This fundamental difference created entirely different approaches to logic, risk assessment, and goal setting. He provided detailed examples of human achievements that should have been impossible, according to Confederation science. Within just the past century, humans had developed powered flight, split the atom, landed on their moon, and created global communication networks. Each of these breakthroughs had been accomplished by individuals who ignored expert consensus about what was feasible. But Zeth's most disturbing findings concerned current human projects that demonstrated capabilities far beyond what their development level should allow. He had discovered a human named Elon Musk who was simultaneously revolutionizing transportation, space travel, and energy production. This individual had decided that humans should become a multiplanetary species and was building the technology to make that goal achievable within decades. Zeth documented teams of human scientists who were developing artificial intelligence, systems that could potentially surpass biological thinking capabilities. Led by researchers like Dr. Jennifer Martinez, these projects were advancing faster than Confederation experts had believed possible. Humans were approaching technological singularity centuries ahead of predicted timelines. Even more remarkable were the ordinary citizens who were solving problems that had stumped galactic experts for millennia. Zeth found engineers who were developing fusion power in their garages, students who were designing faster-than-light communication systems as school projects, and teenagers who were creating medical devices that outperformed equipment used in Confederation hospitals. The pattern was unmistakable. Humans did not just adapt to limitations but actively worked to eliminate them. They treated every obstacle as a temporary challenge rather than a permanent barrier. When told something was impossible, they interpreted that as meaning no one had figured out how to do it yet. Zeth's analysis of human social structures revealed equally disturbing capabilities. Despite having no genetic modifications or technological assistance, humans had developed moral reasoning systems that rivaled the most advanced Confederation ethics programs. They had created concepts like universal human rights, international law, and humanitarian aid that extended compassion beyond tribal boundaries. Most shocking was evidence that these ethical capabilities were still evolving rapidly. Zeth documented social movements that were expanding human definitions of who deserved protection and assistance. They were developing environmental consciousness, animal welfare concerns, and even considering the rights of potential artificial intelligences they had not yet created. This moral flexibility suggested that humans could adapt their ethical frameworks as quickly as their technology advanced. They would not be constrained by rigid value systems that prevented them from changing when circumstances required new approaches. But Zeth's most important finding concerned human children and what they revealed about the species' future potential. He had observed young humans who approached century-old problems with the automatic assumption that solutions must exist. They had access to global information networks that allowed them to learn from the accumulated knowledge of their entire civilization. A girl named Sophie Adams had designed water purification systems that could provide clean drinking water to millions of people at costs far below current methods. A boy named Alex Turner had created prosthetic devices using three-dimensional printing that performed better than commercial alternatives while requiring no expensive manufacturing infrastructure. These examples represented just the beginning of what Zeth suspected would be an explosive expansion of human capabilities. Each generation had access to better tools, more information, and fewer preconceptions about what was possible. They were building upon the achievements of their predecessors while simultaneously questioning every assumption their elders had accepted. Zeth realized that humanity was approaching a developmental threshold that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the galaxy. Within the next century, humans would likely achieve interstellar travel, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and possibly technologies that the Confederation had not even imagined. The question was whether galactic civilization could survive contact with a species that viewed the universe as a collection of problems to be solved rather than limitations to be accepted. In his final analysis, Zeth made a recommendation that he knew would terrify the High Council. The Confederation should not attempt to contain or eliminate humanity. Instead, they should recruit them as allies before humans develop the capability to reshape galactic civilization with or without Confederation approval. Zeth argued that trying to suppress human development would ultimately fail because their psychology made them incapable of accepting permanent defeat. Any attempt to limit their expansion would only motivate them to find ways around those restrictions. Given enough time, they would discover solutions to problems that the Confederation considered unsolvable. More importantly, humans possessed capabilities that could benefit the entire galaxy if properly channeled. Their problem-solving abilities could address challenges that had prevented galactic civilization from advancing for millions of years. Their moral reasoning could help develop ethical frameworks for managing technological development that exceeded current safety protocols. But most valuable was their fundamental assumption that improvement was always possible. Every other species in the galaxy had reached developmental plateaus where they stopped seeking major advances because the challenges seemed too difficult. Humans would never accept such limitations because their psychology would not allow them to believe that problems could not be solved. Szeth concluded his report with a warning that would haunt the High Council for years to come. If the Confederation did not establish peaceful contact with humanity, someone else would. The universe was vast and contained other intelligent species that had not yet been contacted. If humans encountered a civilization that offered them partnership and advanced technology, they would quickly become the dominant force in that region of space. The choice was simple: welcome humans as allies while they were still developing, or face them as competitors when they achieved technological superiority. 3 weeks after Szeth submitted his report, he received new orders that shocked him completely. Instead of being assigned to monitor humans from a distance, he was being sent to establish first contact. The High Council had decided that if they could not prevent humans from reaching the stars, they would rather have them as friends than enemies. As Szeth prepared for the most important diplomatic mission in galactic history, he reflected on how much his understanding had changed since beginning this assignment. He had started by looking for evidence that humans were chaotic and dangerous. Instead, he had discovered that they were the most remarkable species he had ever encountered. The Confederation had spent millions of years believing that intelligence was about avoiding problems and maintaining stability. Humans had proven that true intelligence was about identifying problems and solving them, regardless of how impossible the solutions might seem. They were not just another species that would eventually join galactic civilization. They were a force that would transform it into something entirely new. The universe was about to become a much more interesting place. As Szeth's ship approached Earth for humanity's first official contact with galactic civilization, he smiled using facial muscles he had not known he possessed. He had learned this expression from watching humans and found it perfectly captured his emotional state. For the first time in his existence, Szeth was genuinely excited about the future. If humans could teach the galaxy how to dream impossible dreams and make them reality, then perhaps the age of stagnation was finally coming to an end. Szeth 9947 stood before the massive viewing screen in the Confederation Command Center. His 6 eyes focused on the swirling blue and green planet that hung in the darkness of space. Earth looked peaceful from this distance, but the reports he had read told a different story. Observer Szeth 9947 called Commander Vex 2314 from behind him. "You have been selected for a critical mission." Szeth turned his elongated head toward his superior. The commander's gray skin was marked with the purple stripes that showed his high rank in the Galactic Confederation. Szeth had hoped for this moment for years. Finally, he would get a real assignment instead of monitoring empty space sectors. "What is my mission, Commander?" Szeth asked while keeping his voice calm. "You will observe the species on the 3rd planet of the Sol system. The creatures call themselves humans. Your job is to watch them and record their behavior. The High Council needs detailed reports about their activities." Szeth felt a slight disappointment. This sounded like routine surveillance work. He had wanted something more exciting like first contact protocols or deep space exploration, but he kept his thoughts to himself. The commander activated a holographic display that showed various images of humans. Szeth saw creatures that walked on 2 legs with strange hair covering the tops of their heads. They had only 2 eyes, and their skin came in different colors from pale white to dark brown. "These humans are a dangerous species," the commander continued. "They have been fighting wars for thousands of their years. They destroy their own environment. They cannot seem to live in peace with each other. Previous observers have documented their violent tendencies and unpredictable behavior. Zeth studied the images more carefully. The humans looked small and weak compared to most species in the Confederation. They had no natural weapons like claws or fangs. Their bodies seemed fragile. How could such creatures be considered dangerous? "Sir, if they are so primitive, why does the High Council consider them a threat?" Zeth asked. Commander Vex 2314 touched a control, and the display changed to show scenes of human warfare. Explosions filled the screen along with images of their crude weapons and military vehicles. "Look at these reports," the commander said. "Humans have developed weapons that can destroy their entire planet. They fight wars over resources, territory, and ideas. But most disturbing are the individual behavior patterns that previous observers have noted." The screen showed new images. Zeth saw humans running toward danger instead of away from it. He watched recordings of humans who continued fighting even when they were clearly defeated. Most puzzling were the reports of humans who died protecting complete strangers. "This behavior makes no logical sense," Commander Vex 2314 explained. "Rational beings preserve their own lives above all else. They retreat when facing superior force. They prioritize their genetic relatives over unrelated individuals. But humans do the opposite. They sacrifice themselves for others. They refuse to surrender even when death is certain. This unpredictability makes them extremely dangerous." Zeth absorbed this information while wondering why such behavior would be seen as threatening. In his culture, self-preservation was indeed the highest value. The idea of dying for strangers seemed impossible to understand. "Your mission is to position yourself in orbit around their planet," the commander continued. "Use our advanced cloaking technology to remain hidden. Document their daily activities, their social structures, and especially any examples of their irrational behavior. The High Council needs to understand how this species thinks before they develop space travel." "How long will this assignment last?" Zeth asked. "As long as necessary. Previous observers have sent conflicting reports. Some claim humans are moving toward extinction through their own violence. Others suggest they may actually survive and become a spacefaring civilization. We need clear data to determine which prediction is correct." Zeth received his orders and equipment list. He would have access to the most advanced surveillance technology in the Confederation. His ship would be completely invisible to human detection systems. He could monitor their communications, observe their behavior, and record everything without being discovered. 3 days later, Zeth piloted his observation vessel toward the Sol system. The journey took 2 weeks, during which he studied every file the Confederation had on humans. The reports painted a picture of a chaotic species that seemed to defy all logical patterns of behavior. One report described humans who ran into burning buildings to save people they had never met. Another documented soldiers who shared their food with enemy prisoners. A third report included examples of humans who worked their entire lives to help sick children they were not related to. Zeth found these reports confusing. In every other species in the galaxy, such behavior was either extremely rare or completely absent. Most intelligent life forms followed predictable patterns based on survival instinct and logical thinking. But humans seemed to act against their own interests on a regular basis. When Zeth reached Earth orbit, he activated his cloaking systems and began setting up his observation equipment. The planet below looked beautiful, but he knew that beauty was deceptive. According to the reports, this world was filled with violence and chaos. His first week of observation seemed to confirm what he had read. He monitored human news broadcasts and saw reports of wars, crimes, and conflicts happening all over the planet. Humans fought over money, land, and religious beliefs. They polluted their air and water. They seemed incapable of working together, even when facing problems that threatened them all. Zeth began preparing his first report to the Confederation. Everything he observed matched the previous assessments. Humans were indeed a chaotic and violent species that would likely destroy themselves before achieving space travel. But then something happened that changed everything. On his 8th day of observation, Zeth was monitoring the western coast of North America when seismic sensors detected a massive earthquake. The ground shook violently in a region humans called California. Buildings collapsed and fires started across several cities. Zeth watched the chaos unfold, expecting to see humans panic and flee. Instead, he witnessed something that made no sense. Emergency workers called firefighters were running toward the HFY, burning buildings instead of away from them. They drove directly into the most dangerous areas where structures were still collapsing. One firefighter named Jake Martinez caught Zeth's attention. This human ran into a building that was clearly about to fall down completely. The structure was engulfed in flames and smoke poured from every window. Any logical being would have stayed far away from such obvious danger, but Jake Martinez disappeared into the burning building. Minutes passed and Zeth assumed the human had died. Then Martinez emerged carrying a small human child in his arms. His protective suit was damaged, and Zeth could see that burns covered half of his body. Instead of seeking medical treatment for himself, Martinez immediately asked other humans if there were more people trapped inside. Only after being told that everyone was safe did he allow the medical workers to treat his injuries. Zeth stared at his monitoring screens in confusion. This behavior made no logical sense at all. Jake Martinez had risked his life for a young human he had never met before. He had ignored his own severe injuries to ask about saving others. This went against every principle of rational self-preservation. Zeth marked this incident as an anomaly in his report. Surely this was just one unusual example that did not represent typical human behavior. He decided to continue his observations and focus on documenting the violence and chaos that the Confederation expected to see. But deep in his mind, a small doubt began to form. Maybe there was something about humans that previous observers had missed.